The morning sun cast long shadows across Pearl Harbor as Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the Pacific Fleet's impressive array of battleships anchored in the crystalline waters of Oahu. It was December 6, 1941, and the Hawaiian air carried the scent of plumeria and salt spray. The USS Arizona sat majestically in Battleship Row, her crew preparing for another routine Sunday aboard what many considered the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Morrison had risen early that Saturday morning, unable to shake a peculiar feeling that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Intelligence reports had been filtering through naval headquarters about increased Japanese military activity, but the general consensus among senior officers was that any potential conflict would likely occur in the Philippines or Dutch East Indies. The idea of a direct assault on American soil seemed inconceivable to most military strategists. As Morrison walked through the corridors of the Naval Intelligence Office at Pearl Harbor, he encountered Captain Edwin Layton, the Pacific GAO Fleet's intelligence officer, poring over decoded Japanese diplomatic messages. The atmosphere in the room was tense, filled with the clicking of typewriters and the low murmur of analysts discussing intercepted communications. According to a report later published in the New York Times military archives, American codebreakers had been monitoring Japanese diplomatic traffic for months, though the full significance of these intercepts would only become clear in retrospect. The Japanese consul general in Honolulu, Nagao Kita, had been unusually active in recent weeks, sending detailed reports about ship movements and harbor conditions back to Tokyo. His messages, later revealed to contain precise information about American naval dispositions, painted a comprehensive picture of Pearl Harbor's defenses and vulnerabilities. The consul's residence on Nuuanu Avenue had become a hub of intelligence gathering, with staff members making regular trips to observe the harbor from various vantage points. On Ford Island, the heart of Pearl Harbor's naval aviation complex, Lieutenant Colonel James Rasmussen noticed the unusual number of aircraft maintenance activities scheduled for the weekend. The Army Air Corps had positioned most of its modern fighter aircraft in neat rows, making maintenance more efficient, but also creating what would later be recognized as perfect targets for aerial attack. The sight of dozens of Curtiss P-40 Warhawks and Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses lined up on the tarmac gave Rasmussen a sense of American air power, though he couldn't shake his concern about their vulnerability to surprise attack. Check. Social calendar in Honolulu that weekend was particularly active, with numerous military families attending parties and gatherings throughout the island. The Officers' Club at Hickam Field had scheduled a formal dinner dance, while many enlisted. Men planned to spend their Sunday liberty exploring Waikiki Beach or visiting the bustling markets of downtown Honolulu. This atmosphere of normalcy masked the approaching storm that would fundamentally alter not just Hawaii, but the entire trajectory of American involvement in the Second World War. As evening fell on December 6th, Admiral Kimmel reviewed the latest intelligence summaries in his quarters. The reports indicated continued Japanese military buildups in Southeast Asia, but nothing suggesting an imminent threat to Hawaiian operations. The Pacific Fleet's defensive posture remained at a standard peacetime alert level, with approximately half the crew aboard most vessels and routine security patrols maintaining their regular schedules around the harbor perimeter. The first wave of Japanese aircraft approached Oahu from the north at approximately 7:55 on the morning of December 7, 1941. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the aerial assault from his Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber, looked down upon Pearl Harbor and transmitted the famous code words, "Tora, Tora, Tora," indicating that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Below him, the American Pacific Fleet lay anchored in perfect formation, unaware that the next hour would transform the United States from a reluctant observer to an active participant in global warfare. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was among the first to recognize the gravity of the situation when he observed aircraft with distinctive red circles on their wings diving toward Ford Island. Racing to the radio transmitter, he broadcast the message that would alert the entire Pacific Fleet, "Air raid Pearl Harbor X. This is not drill." The transmission crackled across military communication networks throughout Hawaii, sending shockwaves through command structures that had never seriously contemplated such a scenario on American territory. Aboard the USS Arizona, Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin van Valkenburg were preparing for morning colors when the first bombs began falling. The massive battleship, carrying over 1,500 crew members, became a primary target for Japanese dive bombers equipped with armor-piercing ordnance specifically designed to penetrate heavily armored warships. At 8:06, a devastating explosion ripped through the Arizona's forward magazine, creating a fireball that could be seen from miles away and killing over 1,100 sailors and Marines in an instant. The USS Oklahoma, moored adjacent to the Arizona, came under concentrated torpedo attack from Japanese Kate bombers flying at extremely low altitude across the harbor. Within minutes, multiple torpedo strikes had torn massive holes in the battleship's port side, causing her to list severely before eventually capsizing completely. Over 400 crew members found themselves trapped inside the overturned hull, leading to desperate rescue efforts that would continue for days as survivors tapped on the interior bulkheads, hoping for salvation. According to historical accounts documented in the Pearl Harbor National Memorial Archives, the attack involved over 300 Japanese aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned approximately 200 miles north of Oahu. The assault had been meticulously planned for months, with Japanese intelligence gathering detailed information about American naval schedules, harbor depths, and defensive capabilities. This level of preparation demonstrated the sophistication of Japanese military planning and their commitment to achieving tactical surprise. Chief Petty Officer John Finn, stationed at Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay, witnessed the second wave of attacks targeting Hawaiian airfields. Despite being wounded by strafing aircraft, Finn continued operating a machine gun from an exposed position, shooting at Japanese fighters as they attacked parked American aircraft. His actions, later recognized with the Medal of Honor, exemplified the courage displayed by countless service members who responded instinctively to defend their installations despite being caught completely off guard. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond military casualties and material damage. Civilian populations throughout Hawaii found themselves thrust into wartime conditions without warning, with families seeking shelter as aircraft battled overhead and explosions echoed across the islands. The reality that American territory could be successfully attacked by foreign forces shattered assumptions about geographic security that had influenced American foreign policy for decades. As the Japanese aircraft departed around 10:30, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented destruction, the full magnitude of the assault began to emerge. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed, over 300 aircraft had been eliminated, and more than 2,400 Americans had lost their lives in less than 2 hours of combat. The attack had achieved its tactical objectives, while simultaneously ensuring that American entry into World War II was now inevitable. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received the initial reports of the Pearl Harbor attack while meeting with advisor Harry Hopkins in the White House study. The gravity of the situation became immediately apparent as additional messages flooded in from Hawaii, each providing more devastating details about the scope of Japanese success. Roosevelt's famous declaration that December 7th would be a date which will live in infamy captured not only his personal outrage but the collective American response to what was perceived as an unprovoked act of aggression. Within hours of the attack, emergency sessions were convened throughout Washington as military and civilian leaders grappled with the implications of America's sudden entry into global warfare. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox worked frantically to assess the damage, while simultaneously beginning preparations for what everyone understood would be a prolonged and intensive military campaign. The peacetime military establishment that had been slowly expanding since 1939 would now require massive and immediate transformation. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, recognized that American military production would need to increase exponentially to support operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. The industrial capacity that had been gradually converting from civilian to military production would now require complete mobilization on a scale unprecedented in American history. According to documentation from the National Archives, Marshall immediately contacted key industrial leaders to discuss accelerating production timelines for everything from aircraft and tanks to ammunition and medical supplies. The news of Pearl Harbor spread across the American mainland through radio broadcasts that interrupted regular Sunday programming. Families gathered around their radio sets to hear Edward R. Murrow and other correspondents describe the unfolding situation in Hawaii. Many listeners initially believing they were hearing a fictional drama similar to Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds broadcast. The reality that American soil had been attacked created a psychological transformation that unified the country behind military mobilization in ways that months of European war coverage had been unable to achieve. In Detroit, automotive executives, led by William Knudsen, began immediate discussions about converting automobile production lines to manufacture tanks, aircraft engines, and other military equipment. The concept of the arsenal of democracy, which Roosevelt had articulated in previous speeches, was about to become operational reality as American industrial capacity prepared to support not only domestic military needs, but also the requirements of Allied forces fighting in Europe and Asia. The attack's timing proved particularly significant from a strategic perspective, as it occurred before Congress had resolved ongoing debates about American involvement in foreign conflicts. Isolationist sentiment, which had remained strong throughout the 1930s despite growing Axis aggression, essentially evaporated overnight as Americans confronted the reality that geographic distance provided no protection from modern warfare. The Japanese had inadvertently solved Roosevelt's political dilemma about how to bring America into the war while maintaining democratic legitimacy. Labor organizations across the country pledged to suspend strike activities and increase production schedules to support the war effort. United Auto Workers President Walter Reuther announced that union members would work extended shifts and accept modified wage agreements to ensure maximum output of military equipment. This cooperation between management and labor, which had been contentious throughout the Depression era, demonstrated how Pearl Harbor had created national unity around common objectives. Military recruitment offices experienced unprecedented demand as young men sought to enlist in all branches of service. The attack had personalized the conflict in ways that European battlefields had not, creating emotional connections that translated into voluntary military service on a massive scale. By the end of December 1941, recruitment had increased by over 300% compared to pre-attack levels, indicating the depth of American commitment to military response. The conversion of American industry from peacetime to wartime production represented one of the most remarkable economic transformations in modern history. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, major corporations began retooling their facilities to manufacture military equipment, often requiring complete reorganization of production processes and workforce training programs. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler established dedicated divisions for tank and aircraft production, while shipyards from Maine to California expanded their capacity to build the naval vessels that would carry the war to Japanese home waters. Donald Nelson, appointed by Roosevelt to head the War Production Board, coordinated the massive effort to redirect American manufacturing capability toward military objectives. His office became the nerve center for allocating raw materials, establishing production priorities, and resolving conflicts between competing military requirements. The challenge was immense, as the military needed everything from basic uniforms and boots to sophisticated radar equipment and long-range bombers, all while maintaining sufficient civilian production to sustain the domestic economy. The Manhattan Project, though highly classified, represented perhaps the most ambitious example of wartime industrial mobilization. Following theoretical breakthroughs in nuclear physics during the late 1930s, American scientists had been exploring the possibility of atomic weapons development. Pearl Harbor provided the political justification and resource allocation necessary to transform theoretical research into practical weapons development, though the project's existence remained secret to all but the highest levels of government and military leadership. According to historical records maintained by the Smithsonian Institution, American aircraft production increased from approximately 6,000 units annually in 1940 to over 96,000 units in 1944. This dramatic expansion required not only new manufacturing facilities, but also training programs for workers who had never been involved in precision manufacturing. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking positions in aircraft, assembly, ammunition production, and shipbuilding that had previously been exclusively male occupations. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial efficiency applied to military objectives. Designed by naval architect John Matson, these cargo vessels could be constructed in approximately 4 days, using standardized components and assembly line techniques adapted from automotive manufacturing. The program eventually produced over 2,700 ships, providing the cargo capacity necessary to sustain Allied forces fighting in Europe while simultaneously supporting Pacific operations against Japan. Rationing programs implemented throughout American society demonstrated how Pearl Harbor had transformed civilian attitudes toward personal sacrifice for military objectives. Sugar, gasoline, rubber, and meat became subject to government allocation, with families receiving ration books that limited individual consumption to ensure adequate supplies for military forces. These programs, administered through local volunteer organizations, created a sense of shared sacrifice that maintained civilian morale while supporting military requirements. The development of radar technology, initially a British innovation, received massive American investment following Pearl Harbor, as military leaders recognized the importance of early warning systems for preventing future surprise attacks. Research facilities at MIT and other universities worked closely with industrial partners to develop radar systems suitable for aircraft, ships, and ground installations. This collaboration between academic research and military applications became a model for subsequent technological development throughout the war. Financial mobilization accompanied industrial transformation as the federal government issued war bonds to fund military expansion while simultaneously controlling inflation. Through price controls and wage stabilization programs, the bond drives supported by Hollywood celebrities and community organizations raised over $185 billion while creating psychological investment in military success among civilian populations who had purchased government securities specifically to support the war effort. The Pearl Harbor attack fundamentally altered the strategic balance of World War II by bringing American industrial and military capacity into direct conflict with the Axis powers. Within days of Roosevelt's declaration of war against Japan, Germany and Italy honored their obligations under the Tripartite Pact by declaring war on the United States, thereby creating the global conflict that American isolationists had sought to avoid. This development meant that American military planning would need to address simultaneous campaigns in Europe and the Pacific, requiring resource allocation decisions of unprecedented complexity. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, upon learning of the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly declared that Britain had won the war, recognizing that American entry guaranteed Allied victory regardless of how long the conflict might continue. The combination of British experience, Soviet manpower, and American industrial capacity created a coalition that possessed overwhelming advantages in prolonged warfare, though the path to victory would require several more years of intensive combat operations across multiple theaters. The attack's psychological impact extended far beyond American borders, as resistance movements throughout occupied Europe interpreted American entry as validation that eventual liberation was possible. French, Norwegian, Polish, and other underground organizations received new encouragement to continue their activities against German occupation forces, while simultaneously preparing for eventual Allied invasion operations that would require local support and coordination with regular military forces. Japanese military leaders, despite their tactical success at Pearl Harbor, began to recognize the strategic implications of their decision to attack American territory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had planned the Pearl Harbor operation, privately expressed concerns about Japan's ability to sustain prolonged warfare against American industrial capacity. His famous observation about awakening a sleeping giant reflected his understanding that Japan had achieved tactical surprise at the cost of strategic disadvantage in a prolonged conflict. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, engaged in desperate defensive operations against German invasion forces, welcomed American entry into the war as an opportunity to establish a second front that would divide German military attention. According to diplomatic records from the Roosevelt Presidential Library, Stalin immediately began requesting American military aid through the Lend-Lease program, particularly focusing on aircraft, trucks, and communications equipment that would support Soviet defensive operations during the critical winter of 1941 and 42. The Pearl Harbor attack also influenced neutral nations throughout the world, as countries that had sought to avoid involvement in European conflicts recognized that modern warfare could threaten any nation regardless of geographic isolation or declared neutrality. Brazil, Mexico, and other Latin American countries gradually aligned themselves with American war objectives, providing bases, resources, and eventually military forces to support Allied operations. German submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean intensified following American entry into the war, as Nazi naval commanders attempted to sever supply lines between American industrial centers and British ports before American military production could reach full capacity. The Battle of the Atlantic became a critical campaign that would determine whether American industrial output could effectively reach European battlefields, making convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare immediate priorities for American naval forces. The attack's timing proved particularly significant in relation to German operations on the Eastern Front, where Wehrmacht forces had advanced to within sight of Moscow before being halted by Soviet resistance and winter weather. American entry into the war meant that Germany would eventually face coordinated offensive operations from both east and west, creating the two-front war that German strategic planning had sought to avoid since the beginning of the European conflict. The transformation of American society following Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military mobilization, creating social and economic changes that would influence the country for decades after the war's conclusion. The massive movement of populations from rural areas to industrial centers, the entry of women into previously male-dominated occupations, and the integration of African Americans into defense industries established patterns of social change that would continue throughout the post-war era. These demographic shifts fundamentally altered American society in ways that the participants could hardly have anticipated in December 1941. The technological innovations developed during wartime production had profound implications for post-war economic development. Advances in electronics, metallurgy, chemical production, and manufacturing processes that were initially driven by military requirements eventually found civilian applications that transformed American industry and living standards. The research and development infrastructure created to support wartime objectives became the foundation for continued technological leadership in fields ranging from aviation to telecommunications. Educational institutions throughout the country adapted their curricula to support military objectives, with universities establishing engineering programs, language training, and scientific research capabilities that exceeded anything previously attempted in American higher education. The GI Bill, passed in 1944, would eventually provide educational opportunities for millions of veterans, creating the most educated generation in American history, and establishing higher education as a pathway to middle-class prosperity. The Pearl Harbor attack had demonstrated American vulnerability to surprise attack, leading to permanent changes in military organization and strategic planning that would influence defense policy throughout the Cold War era. The establishment of permanent intelligence agencies, joint military commands, and forward-deployed forces represented a fundamental departure from traditional American preferences for minimal peacetime military establishments and geographic isolation from foreign conflicts. International relationships established during the war created alliance systems that would define global politics for the remainder of the 20th century. The United Nations, NATO, and other multilateral organizations reflected American recognition that geographic isolation no longer provided security in an era of global warfare and technological advancement. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated that distance provided no protection from determined adversaries with modern military capabilities. The economic prosperity that resulted from wartime mobilization established the United States as the dominant global economic power, with American currency, manufacturing capacity, and financial institutions providing the foundation for international trade and development. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, reflected American economic leadership that had been demonstrated through successful mobilization following Pearl Harbor. The attack's commemoration became an important element of American national memory, with December 7th observed annually as a reminder of the costs of military unpreparedness and diplomatic isolation. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," served as a rallying cry throughout the war and continued to influence American foreign policy decisions during subsequent conflicts, as political leaders sought to avoid repeating the strategic surprise that had proven so costly in 1941. The transformation that began with the Pearl Harbor attack ultimately established the United States as a global superpower, with responsibilities and capabilities that extended far beyond traditional American interests. The industrial capacity, military organization, and international relationships developed during World War II created the foundation for American leadership during the Cold War and beyond, making Pearl Harbor not just the beginning of American participation in World War II, but the beginning of American global leadership in the modern era. The attack that was intended to cripple American naval power in the Pacific had instead awakened capabilities that would shape the remainder of the 20th century and establish America's position as the world's dominant military and economic power.